Good morning, AMS2. Welcome to this week's edition of the Today on Earth show with me, Mr. Cates, your weekly guide into the week ahead in Earth science. So, before we go into this week, just a few friendly reminders. Week 1 work is past due, so if somehow, someway, you unfortunately forgot to submit by this time, make sure you're submitting both the Week 1 packet and the driving question board so that you can get a grade for it and not be falling behind. If you did happen to submit it and you didn't quite achieve mastery like you had hoped for, make sure you are looking at the feedback that I had given you and just editing what you're doing and resubmit so that you can get mastery. For week 2, which is this week, the work is unfortunately due tonight at 11:59 p.m., like it is on every science day. Unfortunately, we know this is kind of combined with social studies. It's an abnormal week, so we're giving you a little bit of leniency. Just make sure you're doing it by the end of the week. Put in your best effort. The more you do today, the less you have to do later. Just a little hint. Okay? So, moving ahead to what is happening this week. But before we do that, let's take a step back and talk about what did we do last week. So, for this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Cates, for a segment I like to call Recapping with Cates. Thank you very much, Mr. Cates, for that wonderful introduction. Welcome to Recapping with Cates, with me, Mr. Cates. So, we're going to take a look back at what we accomplished here in week 1. So, first, we decided to have you watch a couple of videos on climate change so that we can get kind of a gauge of how climate change is affecting us on a global and also on a local level. So in the first video, The Hidden Effects of Climate Change, we looked at how is climate change affecting some of the island nations of the world. There, you saw a video and kind of an explanation of some of the different changes that are coming about, and we asked you to make note of that. In the second video, Planet Earth 2, we showed you a kind of a preview for the docu-series for you to kind of get a glimpse of the different animals that are in the world and all their different ecosystems. And we wanted you to become a critical thinker and think, how could climate change possibly affect where they live and how they live? And then finally, for the third video, we brought the issue directly to you. You watched a video on New York City flooding and how that might change over the next couple decades and how it might shape the very neighborhood that you live in. The next set of problems that you did for Earth Science in week 1 was you tried to pull the main ideas from a few different visual texts. This is a really important skill because a lot of science has to do with graphs and with written text that you're going to have to be able to understand and be able to pull just the main ideas so you can convey that to your teachers and to everyone else that you understand. So for visual 1, here we have a graph of atmospheric CO2 in the last 400,000 years. And on the top of that, we see there is a line going across, which is the average CO2 that we'd expect to see here on Earth. So as we saw, and a lot of you noted, it went up and down quite a lot, but it usually was in a pretty good pattern until, as we noticed here, in recent year 1950, sorry, I was about to talk about the end point. 1950, we crossed that threshold, and then it continued to increase into today. So what I'd ask a lot of you in your work is, what do you think could be causing these issues? Why is the CO2 raising so much in this atmosphere? Then we ask you to think of the animals. Think of what is happening to them in a world that they can't control. Pretty sad stuff. We looked at this graphic. Are we in the midst of a 6th mass extinction? So in it, it showed the different types of species of animals and whether they were threatened or they were not threatened. So as we could see in red, there are quite a few species that are really facing threatening from the Earth. And we wanted you to kind of be able to notice that and see that there's already so many species that are extinct and others that are heading in that direction. Finally, we turned it over to more of a written text, a visual text, which again looks at just the future here in New York City. So we looked for you to look at temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, and how climate change and overall health can be affected by climate change. A lot of you answered with really thoughtful answers and talked about how there is a need for change here in New York City because it is apparent that problems may arise very soon. Finally, we talked about what happens if Earth is no longer habitable. How would we find a planet that is just as habitable, and what would we look for? So we asked you to become the people that lead this quest and come up with certain questions that you would ask about our own planet for how it's habitable, or questions that you would ask about a future planet that we may go to that would help us determine that it is habitable. So we asked for 5 questions total, 2 of which were high order, meaning they were not being able to go yes or no answer, were easily Googleable. I was absolutely astonished with how many amazing questions I saw. And I will say that if we needed to find a planet, I'm trusting you, group of students, to lead the way, because it was truly amazing. Thank you very much, Mr. Cage. We really appreciate that recap of week 1. So before we head on to week 2, though, let's hear from you, the audience. What did you like about week 1? What did you not like so much? We're going to ask you to please respond to this collaboration board and put 1 positive, something you liked about the week, and 1 arrow, something you might change for a future week.